And let me go ahead and share a screen. Let me find it. And then we can get started. Okay. Cool. Okay.
I don't think we can see your screen yet.
Oh man. Okay. Says it should.
Maybe I'm wrong. Do others see Alexis's screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, cool. I'm glad.
I can't. Let me try to see it.
I can also put the link in the chat. It's just like a Google Doc that has some helpful diagrams.
Okay, 1 second. Okay.
Okay, can you see it?
Yeah, I mean I can't see it, but it's okay, I guess. So I'll start talking a little bit about. Can everyone hear me clearly? By the way, everyone can hear me, see me. Yeah.
I can hear and see you.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Good. So that's good confirmation. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of these protocols and what makes Phantom, Spectre, and Ghost a little bit different is that they're not exactly uh, alternative consensus protocols in the way that we've been talking about it before, in the sense that they're extremely similar to Bitcoin. So they're permissionless proof of work ledgers which extend the chain by adding a block, and they have some kind of fork choice rule that explains which is the real legitimate structure, right? So I guess in the context of that, you're going to see the same assumptions that you would see in Bitcoin for the most part. You're going to see tolerates up to a majority uh, 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 set of attackers, and it assumes like rational miners, and it has all the same like Bitcoin assumptions that we all know and love. Um, and so it's prone to a lot of the same attacks as a result. So let's start talking a little bit about Ghost, which is the first one, and which has actually been implemented in protocols like Ethereum. So what we have with the whole Bitcoin scaling a debate is that if you want to increase the scalability of Bitcoin, the problem that you quickly run into is that you're going to have orphan blocks. You're going to have blocks that are created at the same time because miners don't have sufficient time to talk to each other. And when you have, for example, short block times, then when two blocks are created in parallel, well, then you have a higher likelihood of forking, right? Because it's not just that you have a block and then another block sequentially afterwards. It's one block, and then you might have two or three blocks that happen afterwards. And so one interesting result is that that Aviv Zohar and Jonathan Sampolinsky from DAG Labs and Hebrew University of Jerusalem came up with was the number of forks that you expect, or number of orphans or children you expect from any block, based on the hash rate of the network, the time, the block time of the network, the size of blocks in the network delay of the network, etc. So kind of going off with that, right? You basically have, let's say you have forks, right? Well, you want some way to kind of resolve those forks. And if miners are trying to extend the chain that they mined, right? If there are two forks created in parallel, if there's a fork created, you want to, one of them is created by miner A, one of them is created by miner B. Miner A will keep mining off of their block, and then miner B will mine off their block, and you basically split the hash power of the network. So that's not good. What you want is some kind of incentive for people to start mining on one version of the chain again. And that was where Ghost came in, right? The idea was that if you have an orphan block, if you have a block that's not included as the blockchain because another block was created and released at the same time, you want the miner who created that block to get some reward because they did do good work to compile that block. And so this is what Ghost does, is that let's say you have one block and two blocks created in parallel, two children created in parallel and released in parallel. Then the child after that needs to reference not only their parent block, which one they actually draw their state from, but they also need to specify any uncle blocks, which are basically blocks that they do not include as part of their state, but they are aware of. And so you would have A and B blocks created by miner A and miner B, and then a new block that where in this new block it is specified that, like, okay, B is my parent and then A is my uncle. And this specifies some kind of mining reward for the miner that created block B. Block A and block B. So that's like interesting, and it's something that Ghost was something that was introduced in Ethereum as a result, because it reduces the likelihood of forking and it rewards miners who have done good work, even if that they produced an orphan block. Okay, that's interesting. But the problem is it doesn't increase the throughput of the network really, because you have these orphan blocks, but they don't have children which draw state from them. They're basically stale. They just sit there, and their miners may have gotten a reward from their existence, but they have not contributed to the network in terms of having new blocks and new transactions. So this is where Avi Zohar and Jonathan Samplinsky thought of Spectre, which is a new protocol, a newer protocol, which tries to include those transactions that were part of uncle blocks. And this is very interesting. So it's basically a new paradigm, and this is where like the block DAG comes into play. So the way Spectre works is like pretty simple. You have this chain, or actually now DAG. Blocks are created. They specify their parents, and not parents and uncles, but all parents. And so what is a legitimate parent? What qualities do you want in a parent? Well, when a new block is created, a new miner is creating a new block, they look at all the tips of this DAG. All the tips are all the blocks that have been created that have no children. All the newest blocks that have been released that have not been added to, we will add to them, is basically the way that children blocks are created. And so when you add to all the tips of the DAG, all the transactions that are counted in those tips, and all the transactions, all the state that's counted in those tips is included in your new child block. So this is pretty easy if you have no conflicts, right? Let's say you have block A and block B, again, that were created in parallel, and you have a new block, and you create this, you include the state of both block A and B. Well, if block A and B don't have any conflicting transactions, there's no double spends, there's nothing like wrong going on. Everything works in harmony because there's no conflicts. Well, then it's fine, right? You can have this new block and it counts transactions from A and transactions from B as having happened. It counts them in its state. But what if you have conflicting transactions? Now, this is where it's a little bit more difficult, right? So, for example, if someone tries to double spend a UTXO, well, then you have a problem, right? Because you can't double spend a UTXO, otherwise you could create infinite money. So the way that this works is a little bit different. It's that someone is calling. Okay, yeah, the way that this works is a little bit different. What you have is that you have some informal voting process, and this is like the interesting part. This voting process is done implicitly and not explicitly. And so what does this voting process mean? Well, so let's say you have two conflicting transactions, X and Y, okay? And what we say is X defeats Y or Y defeats X, okay? To determine which one is the one that came first, or the legitimate transaction. So the way that the implicit voting is done is that any block that has X as an ancestor, transaction X in its state, in its history, we'll say that X defeats any Y that's not in its state. And likewise, any new block that includes Y as part of its state but not X, we'll say that Y defeats X. That's pretty easy. But what about other blocks? Blocks that don't include both. Okay, well, blocks that don't include both, will look at all of their ancestors and will implicitly vote with the majority of their ancestors. And then blocks that have both X and Y will vote implicitly with all of their ancestors. And blocks that have not included either will vote with a majority of their descendants, and blocks that include both will vote with a majority of their ancestors. And basically, what you have is that through this implicit voting process, every single block in this DAG chooses which transaction defeats which other one, but those blocks might disagree. So, for example, if you have a block that has X but not Y, that one thinks that X is a legitimate version of the block DAG. And if something has Y, not X, that block thinks that Y is a legitimate version. There's low consistency in the case of a conflicting set of transactions. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? Anyone have questions? Okay, yeah. So, okay, this is really interesting. The fact that you have this low consistency, or you don't have much agreement necessarily when you have transactions. Okay, so Julian asked why it's called like defeat. That's like I'm not exactly sure why it's called a defeat relation. I think it's because if it's a double spend, for example, you only want one of those transactions to be counted as part of the block DAG in the first place. The other one is completely illegitimate. So it might make sense in that context to say that like Y defeats X because Y counts and X doesn't count. Make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so let's continue on. So this begs a number of problems. The first is, like I was talking about, if you have two conflicting transactions, you may not know which one is ever included as part of the block DAG. If you have new blocks that keep coming and voting implicitly for Y and Z and not ever coming to agreement, you might never have one of them as considered legitimate, and you may never have like consistency or liveness in this case. So that's pretty bad. Optimistically, you're okay because, as we said, if you have no conflicting transactions, then you include everything. So you have like pretty good liveness properties, and you have pretty good consistency properties in the case of no conflicts. But the fact that there might be conflicts will decrease the consistency properties significantly. The other problem is that this defeat relationship, when we say like X defeats Y, is not necessarily, it might have cycles in it. So, for example, X might defeat Y, Y might defeat Z, and Z might itself defeat X, right? And so you have this cyclic relationship of defeat, and it's not clear which is the legitimate transaction, which transaction came first. And so as a result of this, you don't have a linearly ordered log, or you don't have a blockchain. You don't have a set of transactions that are put in order, and as a result of this, you can't have smart contracts, right? So that's a big problem. The fact that you may not get like these liveness guarantees in the event of conflicts, and the fact that you will pretty much never guarantee that you will have a linearly ordered log makes this really good for payments, but it doesn't make it necessarily very good for smart contracts. And that's kind of where Phantom comes in. Alexis is going to talk a little bit about Phantom. It aims to solve this problem of linearly ordering.
Yeah. Does anyone have any remaining questions on Ghost or Spectre? And then we can go ahead and move on to Phantom. Okay. We can start talking about Phantom then. So basically, in Phantom, as you've been mentioned, the goal is to create this linear ordering. And the way that we're going to do this is through recognizing a cluster of honest blocks and then discarding or penalizing the rest. And they go ahead and define a cluster as a K cluster. And so a K cluster is simply a subset of blocks such that each block is connected to every block in it apart from at most K blocks. So for example, if K is 2, then every single block within the cluster should be connected to every other block with the exception of 2 blocks. And so what they posit in Phantom is that honest blocks always form a K cluster because 2 honest blocks are only unconnected in a DAG if they are created at approximately the same time. And in this case, you have at most K blocks created at approximately the same time. So even though all honest blocks will always form a K cluster, there is also the case that an attacker can form a K cluster. But here, the attacker's K cluster will always be smaller than the honest K cluster because the attacker, as long as the attacker has less hash power. So that 51% familiarity that exists in Bitcoin still exists here. So if an attacker controls less than 51% of the hash power, then their K cluster must be smaller. And so those are kind of the basics that we need to understand the Phantom algorithm. The Phantom algorithm is relatively simple. It's just 3 steps, and there are 2 versions that they present in the paper. One is the theoretical NP-hard version, and then the other is a greedy algorithm, which is more implementable. So the NP-hard version proceeds as follows. The first step is to search for the largest K cluster. The second step is to order the blocks via some sort of topological ordering. And the third step is to iterate over the blocks in the prescribed order and accept transactions that are consistent with the history. So the interesting thing that this allows for here is first, you're able to decide your throughput, and then you're able to decide your K. And so if we take the Bitcoin example, in Bitcoin we have low throughput, so we have a 0 cluster. So in the case that I'm running this Phantom algorithm on Bitcoin and I'm searching for the largest K cluster, I'm just searching for the Nakamoto longest chain. So what you can see is that Phantom is pretty much an extension of what we see here with Bitcoin. And so that is the NP-hard version of the algorithm, the theoretical version. But they also present a greedy algorithm, which is implementable. And in this case, all they're doing is replacing that first step. So instead of searching for the largest K cluster, what we're going to do is search for the chain with the largest number of uncles of degree less than or equal to K. And now let's go ahead and dive into what that means. So orphans or uncles in a blockchain situation are well-formed blocks that haven't been included in the blockchain. And so basically what we want to do here is count these uncles that are well connected to the chain. And how do we define well connected? So what we say here is that you can define a K uncle, where K is some sort of arbitrary number. And we say a K uncle is a block which is unconnected to at most K blocks in the chain. So by this definition, the chain itself would be a 0 uncle because it's connected to every block in the chain. So basically what we're looking for, if you see the diagram that's on the Google Doc, is the chain with the most uncles of degree less than K. So this honest blue chain here has the most uncles with degree less than or equal to K. And so that's what allows us to say that this is the largest K cluster. And then steps 2 and 3 are the same as from before. So you order the blocks via that topological ordering and then iterate over them. And so the interesting thing that Phantom provides is that you have your throughput that's not limited by the protocol. Your throughput might still be limited by the network, but you get to define what throughput you want and then select a K accordingly. And it's relatively simple to implement, considering that you have that greedy algorithm with just 3 steps. The cons are that there are poor waiting times when there are visible conflicts in this DAG. So while those conflicts resolve relatively quickly when it comes to payments, this still, while Phantom is an improvement over Spectre, it's still relatively difficult for smart contracting. It's pretty easy to send 2 conflicting transactions in a smart contract situation, and then you're faced with very poor waiting times. And so that's kind of the gist of Phantom. If there are any questions on Phantom, let me know. Just let me know now. Okay. Okay. I guess that's good then. And then an interesting thing, like as Jubin was talking about before, is that a lot of these protocols are very much related to the Bitcoin protocol scheme. And so we can kind of compare Bitcoin versus Spectre versus Phantom versus Spectre and Phantom and see the differences in throughput, confirmation times, and ordering. And so we've talked about Spectre and Phantom. I'm assuming we're all pretty familiar with Bitcoin. And so I'm going to go ahead and go through the Spectre plus Phantom case because this is, I think, is pretty interesting. So if you wanted to combine both Spectre and Phantom, you gain those very fast confirmation times that Spectre allows for, but you do lose the linear ordering that exists in Phantom. And thinking about how we actually combine these two protocols together, the way in which that works is that after we have found our largest K cluster in Phantom, then we go ahead and run Spectre on that K cluster. So we basically run Spectre on a subcomponent of our DAG after selecting the largest K cluster. And that allows for this very unique confirmation that provides very fast confirmation times with the very slow confirmation times. So basically, like you take Spectre where you have fast confirmation times without conflicts. Confirmation time is not necessarily guaranteed with conflicts, and you change that. So even if you have conflicts, you're still able to have confirmation. It's just slower. And so that's what the Spectre plus Phantom paradigm allows for.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions on Bitcoin, Spectre, Phantom, Spectre plus Phantom, Ghost, all of these different DAG protocols that fall in this DAG family? Yeah, we can go.
So yeah, I was gonna. Sorry. Yeah, so I was gonna just say. So basically, wait. Oh, could you explain again? Oh, there is actually questions from Julian. I can't answer that because of Alex. Do you want to take that from the Phantom point of view?
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to the diagram. So basically, in Phantom, let's see. So interesting. So in Bitcoin, when you have conflicts, you would usually, so in Bitcoin, if I have like two blocks created at the same time, then what happens is there's a fork and you end up choosing one with the longest chain, right? But then in Phantom, let me take a look and see what happens. Yeah.
What do you exactly mean by a conflict in Bitcoin versus in Phantom? Do you mean like two blocks that have like a double spend or something like that? Is he typing? Let me check this. Okay, yeah. I mean, so I think so the reason so a conflict in Bitcoin is like imagine two blocks that are created at the same time with like a conflicting transaction, so a double spend basically, right? Well, then you have a fork, so you have to choose one of them. The good thing about Phantom is that you also, let's say you have two blocks created at the same time that have conflicting transactions, a double spend in it, because you have this property of like a complete linear ordering, it's very clear which defeats the other, right? Which conflicting transaction defeats the other one, because it's the one that comes first in this linear ordering. And the problem is in Spectre, because you don't have this, you can't resolve the conflict. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, so wait, let me just like get into one thing. So what's interesting about these protocols, I think, is that they're very promising start, and it's clear there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of really interesting things that can be done. I mean, just in the last few years, you've gone all the way from Ghost to Phantom, and there's no reason why we can't see DAG-based protocols of this nature that are like very simple and very good for linear ordering or good for payments. That's something I like about these. There are drawbacks of these protocols. You don't get a full linear ordering inspector. You don't have resolution of conflicts in inspector in a timely fashion. And in Phantom, basically the entire algorithm for choosing a K cluster is an NP hard problem. And so you have to resort to greedy algorithms for which you don't have these same guarantees that you do in the NP hard version. It seems like attackers might be able to take advantage of that. It's not exactly clear, but these are really interesting and promising starts, but they're not. There are still drawbacks that exist in these protocols. I guess that's my view on it right now.
Yeah, I definitely think that this set of DAG protocols is very interesting, and there are a lot of people who have been exploring DAGs lately. So you had IOTA with the Tangle, and then you had Hashgraph. But the interesting thing is that a lot of these DAG protocols are very, very different from one another. Like beyond the fact that they're just DAGs, with Bitcoin Ghost, Spectre, Phantom, you have this sort of family of DAG protocols.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's it. Unless there's any more questions,
Questions about
we'll
about like any of the SOKs or anything else like related.
Okay. I think that's it.
Okay.
Awesome.
Cool.
Okay, we'll see you.
Yeah. Next community call will be not next Saturday, but the Saturday after, and we can discuss on Telegram exactly what we want to be talking about then.
Yeah, and we'll try to have a guest again. I think that was really valuable to have Sunny and David on last time.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, peace.
All right.